Hello, my friends. Welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, relax. Our story is ready to unfold. Chapter 1. The Bitter Frost and the Legal Vulture. The fog rolled in off Lochdew, thick and grey as sheep's wool that had been left too long in the rain. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his Croft House police station and surveyed the bleak landscape with a certain satisfaction. Weather like this meant that the good folk of the village would stay indoors, and if the good folk stayed indoors, there would be no crime for him to investigate. No crime meant no paperwork, and no paperwork meant he could spend the afternoon tending to his sheep. Hamish was a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and a lazy smile that had fooled more than one superior officer into thinking him an amiable idiot. He had spent the better part of his career cultivating this impression, as the alternative was promotion, and promotion meant transfer away from Lochdew, a fate he considered only marginally better than death. "Come on, Lugs," he called to his dog, a strange beast with an odd appearance and a placid temperament that matched his master's. The wild cat, Sonsi, followed them out, her amber eyes glowing in the grey light. Hamish had rescued her as a kitten, and though everyone in the village insisted that wild cats could never be domesticated, Mrs. Sonsi had made herself quite at home in the police station. The sheep were huddled together in the small field behind the station, their breath steaming in the cold air. Hamish checked their water and scattered some feed, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who knew exactly how much work was required and not an ounce more. He was just heading back inside, looking forward to a cup of tea and perhaps a wee nap, when he heard the sound of an expensive car engine labouring up the single-track road that led to Lochdew. Hamish sighed. Nothing good ever came from expensive cars in remote Highland villages. The vehicle that pulled up in front of the police station was a sleek black Range Rover, far too clean and new for the muddy roads of Sutherland. The man who emerged from it was equally out of place. He wore a cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than Hamish earned in 6 months, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine that would be ruined within minutes of walking on the peaty Highland soil. "You there," the man called out imperiously. "Are you the local constable?" Hamish considered denying it, but the police station sign rather gave the game away. "Aye," he said mildly. "That would be me, Hamish Macbeth." "Percival Thorne," the man announced, as if this should mean something. "I'm here on business, legal business. I trust you'll ensure that the locals cooperate with my inquiries." There was something in the man's tone that made Hamish's hackles rise, though he kept his expression pleasant. "What sort of inquiries would those be, mister?" "Thorne? I've been retained by a property development consortium to verify certain land deeds in this area. There are irregularities that need to be addressed. Quite serious irregularities, I might add." "Is that so?" Hamish said, his voice still mild but his mind working quickly. Property developers meant trouble, and property developers with London solicitors meant serious trouble. "Well, you'll be wanting to speak to the local council then. The office is in Strathbane." "I'll speak to whomever I please," Thorne said sharply, "including the occupants of several buildings whose ownership is, shall we say, questionable. I'll be staying at Tommel Castle Hotel for the next week while I conduct my investigation." He climbed back into his Range Rover without another word and drove off, leaving Hamish standing in the road with a sense of impending disaster settling over him like the fog. By evening the whole village had heard about Percival Thorne, and by evening Percival Thorne had made himself thoroughly despised by everyone he'd encountered. Hamish heard the news from the Curry twins, who came to the police station with their usual litany of complaints. "He was at the pub," Nessie announced. "At the pub," Jessie echoed. "Being rude to everyone," Nessie continued. "Everyone," Jessie confirmed. "Said he was going to foreclose on Archie McLean's harbour shed." "The harbour shed? And the Heritage Centre?" "The centre?" Hamish groaned inwardly. The Heritage Centre was the pride of Lochdew. A small museum housed in the old schoolhouse where local volunteers displayed artefacts and documents about the village's history. If Thorn was threatening that, he was threatening the heart of the community. Said the deeds were forged decades ago, Nessie added with relish. Forged, Jessie repeated. Hamish made his way to the pub where he found the atmosphere decidedly hostile. Archie McLean was red-faced with fury, and several other locals were muttering darkly about what ought to be done to fancy London lawyers who came north to cause trouble. Thorn himself sat at a corner table, apparently oblivious to the anger he had generated, studying a sheaf of documents and sipping an expensive whisky that he had brought with him, disdaining the local varieties. "The man's a menace," Archie growled to Hamish. Says my grandfather's deed to the harbour shed was never properly registered. 50 years we've had that shed, and now some London vulture wants to take it away." Before Hamish could respond, a soft voice cut through the angry muttering. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Mary Ross, the retired school mistress who volunteered at the Heritage Centre. She was a small, neat woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a gentle manner that made her universally liked in the village. "I'm sure Mr. Thorn is simply doing his job," Mary continued, moving to Thorn's table with a grace that belied her years. "Perhaps if we all calm down and discuss this rationally, we can sort out any confusion." "There's no confusion," Thorn said coldly. "These people have been occupying property without clear title for years. That's fraud, pure and simple." "Well," Mary said, her voice still sweet as honey, "I'm sure we can find all the relevant documents. I've been organising the village archives for years. Why don't you come to the Heritage Centre tomorrow and I'll show you everything we have?" Thorn grunted, which might have been agreement, and Mary turned to the other villagers. "Now then, who would like some tea? I think we could all do with something to settle our nerves." Hamish watched as she bustled about, serving tea and speaking quietly to the angry locals, soothing tempers with the skill of someone who had spent decades managing a classroom full of fractious children. By the time she left, the pub had returned to something approaching normal, though the dark looks directed at Thorn had not entirely disappeared. Later that evening, as Hamish was settling down with his dinner, there came a knock at the door. It was Mary Ross, holding a basket covered with a clean tea towel. "I thought you might like some scones, Hamish," she said with a warm smile. "Fresh baked this afternoon. It's bitter cold tonight, and a man needs something to keep his strength up." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Ross," Hamish said, accepting the basket. The scones were still warm and the smell was heavenly. "Not at all. You work so hard for us all, it's the least I can do." She paused, looking up at him with concern. "I do hope this business with Mr. Thorn won't cause too much trouble. The village has been so peaceful lately." "Aye, well, we'll see what tomorrow brings," Hamish said. As he watched her walk back down the path, her small figure disappearing into the fog, Hamish felt a vague unease that he could not quite name. But the scones were excellent, and Luggs was looking at him hopefully, and soon enough he had forgotten his concerns in the simple pleasure of a warm fire and good food on a cold Highland night. Tomorrow, he thought, would take care of itself. It always did. Chapter 2. Death in the Locked Schoolhouse. Hamish woke to a hammering on the door that suggested either the end of the world or trouble of a more immediate nature. He glanced at the clock and groaned. 6 in the morning was an ungodly hour for anyone to be calling, particularly in a Highland winter when it was still pitch dark outside. Luggs barked once, more out of principle than alarm, and Sonsy merely opened one amber eye before closing it again, unimpressed by the urgency of whoever was making such a racket. Hamish pulled on his uniform trousers over his pyjamas and stumbled to the door, his red hair standing on end. On the doorstep stood Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, her face pale in the dim light from the police station. "Hamish, you must come quickly," she gasped. "It's Percival Thorn." "He's dead." That woke Hamish up faster than any amount of coffee could have done. "Dead? Where?" "At the old schoolhouse. Mary Ross found him when she went to open up this morning. Oh, Hamish, it's dreadful." Hamish grabbed his jacket and torch and followed Angela through the grey dawn. The fog had lifted slightly. but a bitter frost had settled over everything, making the ground treacherous underfoot. The old schoolhouse sat at the edge of the village, a solid stone building that had served as the local school until the new one had been built in the 1960s. Now it housed the Heritage Centre, full of old photographs, fishing equipment, and various artefacts that told the story of Loch Dubh through the centuries. A small crowd had already gathered outside, their breath steaming in the cold air. Mary Ross stood to one side, always wrapped in a thick coat, her face shocked and pale. Dr. Brodie was with her, and Hamish was relieved to see that at least someone had had the sense to call the doctor. "She's had a terrible shock," Dr. Brodie said quietly as Hamish approached. "Found him not 20 minutes ago when she came to prepare for Mr. Thorne's visit." "Has anyone touched anything?" Hamish asked. "I checked for a pulse," the doctor said, "but the man's been dead for hours, cold as ice." Hamish turned to Mary. "Mrs. Ross, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Mary's voice was steady despite the shock in her eyes. "I came at 6 o'clock, as I always do on Tuesdays. I have a key, of course. The door was locked from the inside with the bolt across. I thought that was strange because no one should have been here overnight. I called out, thinking perhaps someone had locked themselves in by accident, but there was no answer. I had to go round to the back and use the spare key we keep hidden in the old coal shed." "And the back door was locked too?" "Yes, but not bolted. When I came inside and went through to the main schoolroom, I found him." She shuddered. "That terrible heavy book press from the display had fallen on his head. At least I thought it had fallen. But then I saw the blood, and I knew it couldn't have been an accident." Hamish took his torch and entered the building, careful not to disturb anything. The old schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and the particular mustiness of buildings that are only intermittently heated. The main schoolroom had been preserved much as it would have looked 100 years ago, either with old wooden desks and a blackboard and various teaching implements displayed on the walls and shelves. Percival Thorne lay on the floor near the heritage display, his expensive cashmere coat soaked with blood. The antique cast-iron book press, a massive thing that must have weighed close to 50 pounds, lay beside him. Hamish could see immediately that this was no accident. The blow had been precise and deliberate, delivered with considerable force to the back of the skull. What was more puzzling was the locked door. Hamish examined it carefully. It was solid oak, old as the building itself, with a heavy iron bolt on the inside. There was no way it could have been locked from the outside. The windows were all latched from within, and in any case they were too small for a person to climb through. He was still examining the scene when he heard the sound of cars pulling up outside. His heart sank. He recognised that particular engine note. It was Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, a fat, belligerent man who drank too much and hated Hamish with a passion that bordered on obsession. Blair burst into the schoolhouse with his usual lack of grace, breathing heavily from the short walk from his car. Behind him came Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, a more reasonable man whose main weakness was a fondness for whiskey that would have impressed even a seasoned Highland drinker. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair wheezed, his small eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Been mucking about with my crime scene, have you?" "Just securing it, sir," Hamish said mildly. "The deceased is Percival Thorne, a solicitor from London. He arrived yesterday making threats about property deeds." "Did he now? Well, that gives half the village a motive then, doesn't it?" Blair looked around the room with satisfaction. "Locked from the inside, is it? Some kind of suicide, then?" "I don't think a man can commit suicide by dropping a £50 book press on the back of his own head, sir," Hamish ventured. Blair's face reddened. "Don't you get clever with me, Macbeth. This is my investigation now. You just keep the locals out of my way while proper detectives do proper detective work." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a slight shrug that said more clearly than words that there was no point arguing with Blair when he was in this mood. The forensics team arrived and began their work while Blair held court outside, questioning the gathered villagers with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Hamish watched as Mary Ross, despite her obvious distress, tried to be helpful, producing a notebook from her bag. "I took the liberty of making a list," she said quietly to Blair, "Of everyone Mr. Thorne threatened yesterday. I thought it might save time." Blair snatched the notebook and scanned it, his piggy eyes lighting up. "Very helpful, Mrs. Ross. Very helpful indeed. Not like some people who try to obstruct the course of justice." He shot a meaningful glare at Hamish, who maintained his expression of mild stupidity. The list was thorough, Hamish noted as he read it over Blair's shoulder. Archie McLean was at the top, followed by several other villagers who owned property with potentially questionable deeds. Dr. Brodie's name was there too, though Mary had mentioned old medical matter without elaborating. "Right," Blair announced loudly. "I want statements from everyone on this list. Anderson, you take the doctor. Macbeth, you can make yourself useful by getting coffee for the forensics team." Hamish nodded agreeably and went to find Mary, who was talking quietly with the Curry twins. "Mrs. Ross, would you mind helping me with the coffee? I'm afraid I don't know where things are kept in the Heritage Centre." "Of course, Hamish." Mary followed him to the small kitchen area at the back of the building. Her hands shook slightly as she filled the kettle. "That was very thorough, your list," Hamish said casually. "I've always believed in being prepared," Mary replied. "My years as a teacher, you know. His organisation is everything. You must know everyone in the village very well. I taught most of them, or their parents. Loch Dubh is my home. It breaks my heart to see something like this happen here." She busied herself arranging cups on a tray, and Hamish studied her thoughtfully. There was something almost too helpful about her behaviour, too perfectly timed. But then again, she was a retired schoolmistress, and organisation was probably second nature to her. When he brought the coffee out to the shivering Strathbane detectives, he found Blair examining a set of muddy footprints near the back entrance. "Size 11 Wellingtons," the chief forensics officer was saying. "Fresh mud, brought in some time last night." "Whose are they?" Blair demanded. "Could be anyone's," Hamish said. "Half the men in the village wear size 11. But only one of them had a public row with the deceased yesterday afternoon, threatening violence," Blair said triumphantly. "Archie McLean. I want him brought in for questioning immediately." Hamish's heart sank. Archie was many things, loud and occasionally drunk among them, but he was no killer. Still, there was no point arguing with Blair when he had the bit between his teeth. As Blair strutted about giving orders, Hamish noticed Mary Ross standing quietly by the door watching the proceedings with an expression of concern. When she caught his eye, she gave him a sad, sympathetic smile. "Poor Archie," she said softly. "I do hope this is all a terrible mistake. Though I did wonder, whether Mr. Thorne might have disturbed a thief. There are always rumours about Jacobite gold being hidden in these old buildings." "Aye," Hamish said, "there are always rumours." But as he watched the forensics team work and Blair preen about his supposed brilliant deduction, Hamish had the distinct feeling that the truth was going to be considerably more complicated than a simple case of village revenge. The locked room bothered him, and so, if he was being honest, did the exceedingly helpful Mrs. Mary Ross. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had endured enough of Blair's bluster to last him several lifetimes. The Detective Chief Inspector had commandeered the police station as his base of operations, bellowing orders and drinking Hamish's tea as if he owned the place. When Blair finally departed to terrorise the staff at Tommel Castle Hotel, Hamish seized his chance to escape. He knew that Blair would pursue Archie McLean with the single-minded determination of a terrier after a rat, regardless of actual evidence or common sense. The only way to save the fisherman from Blair's vindictive incompetence was to solve the case himself, quietly and without official recognition. This suited Hamish perfectly. Recognition led to promotion, and promotion led away from Loch Dubh. His first stop was the Curry twins' cottage, a neat little house with lace curtains that twitched whenever anyone passed by. The sisters were the village's unofficial intelligence network, though getting information from them required patience and the ability to hear everything said twice. Nessie opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been waiting for him. Which, Hamish reflected, she probably had been. "Hamish Macbeth," she declared. "Macbeth," Jessie echoed from behind her sister's shoulder. "You'll be wanting to know about the stranger," Nessie continued. The stranger, Jessie confirmed. Hamish's interest sharpened. What stranger would that be? Young man he was, Nessie said, settling into her chair with the air of someone about to tell a good story. Saw him yesterday afternoon. Down by the harbour. By the harbour, Jessie repeated. Arguing with that Thorn fellow they were. Arguing fierce. Could you describe him? Hamish asked, pulling out his notebook more for show than necessity. The twins would remember every detail. 30-ish, Nessie said thoughtfully. Tall, dark hair, wearing one of those fancy puffer jackets. Fancy, Jessie agreed. City clothes, Nessie added with disdain. Not from around here. Not from here. And what were they arguing about? The twins exchanged glances. Couldn't hear properly, Nessie admitted, but the young man looked angry. Very angry, Jessie confirmed. Shaking his fist he was. Shaking it. Hamish thanked them and made his way to Angus MacDonald's cottage on the hill. Angus was an old man with a white beard and the reputation of being a seer, which Hamish privately believed was nonsense. However, Angus had lived in Lochdoub all his life and had an uncanny knack for knowing everyone's business, which was far more useful than any supposed second sight. He found Angus sitting by his peat fire, smoking his pipe and looking every inch the Highland mystic he pretended to be. "I've been expecting you," Angus said solemnly. "I'm sure you have," Hamish replied dryly. "The whole village knows I'm investigating." Angus's eyes twinkled. "Aye, well, sit yourself down, laddie. I ken what you're after. Do you know anything about a young man arguing with Thorn yesterday?" "That would be Callum Vane," Angus said, puffing on his pipe. "Thorn's nephew, or so I heard. Arrived on the afternoon bus from Edinburgh. Stayed the night at Mrs. Mackenzie's bed and breakfast." "How did you know he was Thorn's nephew?" "Because I was having my dram at the pub when young Vane came in demanding to see his uncle. Made quite a scene, he did. Said Thorn owed him money, his rightful inheritance, and if he didn't get it, there'd be trouble." Hamish made a note of this. "Anyone else have words with Thorn?" "Half the village, by my count. But if you're asking who had real cause, you might want to look at Dr. Brodie." This surprised Hamish. Dr. Brodie was one of the most respected men in Lochdoub, a gentle soul who treated his patients with unfailing kindness and only charged those who could afford to pay. The doctor? What would he have against Thorn? Angus tapped his pipe against the fireplace. "Old business, from what I gather. Something about a patient who died under Brodie's care years ago, when he was just starting out. Thorn somehow got hold of the medical records and was threatening to report him to the General Medical Council. Ruin his career, it would." "That doesn't sound like something Thorn would have access to," Hamish said slowly. "Aye, well, the man was a solicitor. They have ways of getting information that honest folk don't." After leaving Angus, Hamish drove to Strathbane, where he found Jimmy Anderson in his usual haunt, a dreary pub near the police headquarters. Jimmy was already on his second whisky, looking like a man who had endured several hours of Blair's company. "Hamish," he said with relief, "sit down before someone sees us together and tells Blair." Hamish bought them both a dram, a generous one in Jimmy's case. "I need a favour." "Don't you always?" But Jimmy was smiling. "What is it this time?" "I need to see the preliminary autopsy report and anything forensics has found." Jimmy sighed. "Blair will have my head if he finds out." "Blair won't find out. And besides, you know as well as I do that Archie McLean didn't kill anyone." "Aye, I know it. But try telling that to Blair when he's convinced he's got his man." Jimmy pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. "Right, here we are. Death occurred between midnight and 2 in the morning. Single blow to the back of the skull delivered with considerable force. The book press was definitely the murder weapon. Blood and hair match the victim." "What about the locked room?" "That's the puzzle, isn't it? Forensics can't figure out how the killer got out. The door was bolted from inside, windows latched, no secret passages that they could find. It's like something out of a detective novel." "Any fingerprints?" "Plenty. It's a public heritage centre, so there are prints everywhere. They're still processing them, but so far nothing unusual. Thorn's prints are on the door handle and several of the display cases, which makes sense if he was examining the place before he died. What about the footprints outside? Jimmy took a long drink. Size 11 Wellingtons, like Blair said. Could belong to half the men in the village. The mud matches the path between the pub and the schoolhouse. So whoever left them walked that way sometime yesterday evening or night. Hamish absorbed this information. And the mysterious nephew? Callum Vane? Ah, now there's an interesting one. I ran a check on him. He's got gambling debts up to his eyeballs. Bookies in Edinburgh are looking for him. If he was expecting an inheritance from Uncle Percival, he's going to be disappointed. Thorn's will leaves everything to a cat's home in Surrey. Does Vane know that? Couldn't say, but it gives him a motive, doesn't it? Kill Uncle before he changes his will, or maybe out of spite when he realised he wasn't getting anything. They talked for another half hour, with Jimmy sharing details from the investigation files that Blair would never willingly give Hamish. By the time Hamish left, he had a much clearer picture of the case, though the solution remained frustratingly out of reach. On his way back to Lochdew, Hamish's mobile rang. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife, and she sounded distressed. "Hamish, can you come over? It's important." He found her in the kitchen of the doctor's house, wringing her hands anxiously. "It's John," she said. "Dr. Brodie. He's been behaving very strangely since the murder. Going out at odd hours, won't tell me where, and tonight I found this in his coat pocket." She handed Hamish a crumpled piece of paper. It was a photocopy of an old medical record, and scrawled across the top in bold letters were the words, "Pay up, or I go to the GMC PT." Hamish folded the paper carefully. "Where is the doctor now?" "Out. He said he had a call to make, but there are no patients sick that I know of." "Hamish, John wouldn't hurt anyone. He's the gentlest man alive." "I'm sure he is, Mrs. Brodie. Don't worry yourself, I'll have a word with him." But as Hamish drove back through the dark Highland night, he wondered just how many secrets Percival Thorn had uncovered in his brief time in Lochdew, and how many people had reasons to want him dead. The case was becoming more tangled by the hour, and somewhere in the midst of it all, the killer was walking free, secure in the knowledge that they had committed what appeared to be an impossible crime. The lights were on in the old schoolhouse as he passed, and through the window he could see Mary Ross, still cataloguing and organising despite the late hour. She waved when she saw him, her smile visible even in the dim light. Hamish waved back, but the feeling of unease that had been growing in the back of his mind refused to go away. Something about this case wasn't quite right, and he had the distinct impression that he was missing something obvious, something that was hiding in plain sight. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. The next morning brought a change in the weather. The frost had given way to a thin, persistent rain that seemed determined to soak through every layer of clothing. Hamish stood at his kitchen window, watching the grey clouds scud across the hills, while Luggs crunched his breakfast and Sonsi cleaned her whiskers with fastidious care. Blair had telephoned at an unconscionably early hour to bark orders about keeping the village under control, which Hamish interpreted as an invitation to stay well away from the official investigation. This suited him perfectly. While Blair bumbled about arresting innocent fishermen, Hamish could do some real detective work. Jimmy Anderson had let slip during their session at the pub that Thorn had been staying at one of the holiday cottages near the loch rather than at Tommel Castle Hotel as he had originally claimed. The expensive hotel had apparently not met his exacting standards. This was useful information, because it meant that Blair and his team had not yet searched Thorn's actual accommodation. The cottage was one of 3 modern builds that had been erected to cater to tourists, though in January they stood empty, their windows dark and unwelcoming. Hamish knew that Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, managed the rentals, and a quick telephone call established that she had not yet been asked for the keys by the Strathbane police. "Terrible business," Mrs. Wellington said over the phone. "The man paid cash for a week in advance, didn't even blink at the price, said he valued his privacy. Say, I haven't been inside since he took occupancy. Should I give the keys to that dreadful Blair man?" "I'll save you the trouble," Hamish said smoothly. "I can collect them and pass them along to the investigation team." "Oh, would you? That's very kind, Hamish. Though I must say I don't think much of this Blair fellow. He was quite rude to the Reverend yesterday, suggesting that clergy weren't above suspicion, Hamish collected the keys within the hour, carefully neglecting to mention to anyone that he had them. The cottage was exactly as he expected, expensively furnished in the modern style that tried too hard to be rustic. Thorne had left his belongings scattered about with the carelessness of a man who expected maid service. A laptop sat on the dining table, IAM password protected and therefore useless without the technical resources Hamish lacked. But a leather briefcase yielded more immediate results: property surveys, land registry documents, and a file of historical deeds relating to various Loch-Dubh buildings. Thorne had been thorough in his research. Hamish had to give him that. It was when Hamish examined the bedroom that he found something interesting. Behind a rather ugly print of Highland cattle hung a small wall safe, the kind that hotel guests might use for valuables. It had a simple combination lock, and Hamish, who had developed certain skills during his years in the police force, had it open within 10 minutes. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the sort that might have been used for accounts but was instead filled with neat, spidery handwriting. As Hamish read through the entries, his opinion of Percival Thorne, already low, sank to new depths. The ledger was a record of blackmail, pure and simple. Each entry documented a person's name, the nature of their indiscretion, and the amount they had paid or been asked to pay. Some entries related to Loch-Dubh residents, others to people scattered across the Highlands. Thorne had been running a systematic operation, using his access to legal records and land registries to uncover secrets, then squeezing money from his victims. Archie McLean's name was there, his harbour shed not just threatened with foreclosure, but used as leverage to extract regular payments. Dr. Brodie was listed too, the old medical case described in clinical detail along with a note that the doctor had refused to pay, making him a difficult subject requiring pressure escalation. There were others. Mrs. Mackenzie, who ran the bed and breakfast, had apparently been paying to keep quiet about an irregular marriage in her youth. Even the Curry twins' late father had been a victim, though the nature of his transgression was vague. Hamish photographed each page with his mobile phone, his anger growing. Thorne had been a monster, pure and simple, and while that didn't justify murder, it certainly explained why half the village had wanted him dead. He was about to close the safe when he noticed something else. A small folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the ledger. Unfolding it carefully, he found a photocopy of what appeared to be an old newspaper article from the Sutherland Courier, dated 30 years earlier, and the headline read, "Local businessman found dead in apparent suicide." The article described the death of one Robert Ross, a shopkeeper who had hanged himself after his business failed due to fraudulent dealings by an unnamed London financier. The deceased had left behind a wife and a young daughter. Hamish stared at the name. Ross. It was common enough in the Highlands, but still something nagged at him. He photographed the article and carefully replaced everything in the safe exactly as he had found it, spinning the combination lock to its original position. As he was leaving the cottage, his phone rang. It was Dr. Brodie, sounding agitated. "Hamish, can we meet? I need to explain about last night." They met at a quiet spot overlooking the loch, where the chances of being observed were minimal. The doctor looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. "I know what Angela showed you," he began without preamble. "That blackmail note from Thorne. Yes, he was threatening me, and yes, I was out last night. But I wasn't murdering anyone, Hamish. I was disposing of evidence." "What sort of evidence?" Brodie pulled a heavy burlap sack from the boot of his car. The smell hit Hamish immediately. "Salmon," he said flatly. "Poached salmon, to be precise, from the Laird stretch of the river. I know it was stupid, Hamish, but it's tradition. Every doctor in Loch-Dubh for the past 100 years has taken one salmon a year from that river. It's an unwritten right. The Laird might not see it that way. I know. But my wife, Angela, she's been so pleased with herself in managing our budget. She doesn't know that we're actually quite short of money. If she knew I'd been poaching to save on the grocery bill, she'd be mortified. So I buried the evidence, scales and guts and all, before the Strathbane forensics team started examining every inch of the village." Hamish looked at the worried doctor and made a decision. "Where did you bury it?" In the woods behind the old schoolhouse, I'm afraid. I thought the ground would be softer there. Right then. You stay here. I'll go and retrieve it, and we'll dispose of it properly somewhere that won't connect you to the murder scene. Relief flooded Brodie's face. Thank you, Hamish. I swear to you I had nothing to do with Thorne's death. I know you didn't, but for future reference, Doctor, next time you want to poach a salmon, I'd do it somewhere that isn't adjacent to a murder investigation. Hamish spent the next hour digging up the buried fish remains and reburying them in a bog 3 miles from the village, a task that did nothing for his uniform or his temper. But it was part of being a Highland constable, he reflected. The law was one thing, but Highland tradition and common sense were another, and a wise policeman knew when to prioritise the latter. By the time he returned to the police station, cold, muddy, and smelling distinctly of fish, he found Mary Ross waiting on his doorstep with a thermos of soup and a sympathetic smile. "I saw you out and about in this dreadful weather," she said. "I thought you might need something warm." "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Ross." "Not at all. We all appreciate what you do for us, Hamish. Keeping us safe." She paused, then added, "I've been thinking about poor Mr. Thorne. It occurred to me that perhaps someone broke in looking for valuables. There are always rumours about Jacobite gold hidden in these old buildings. People can be quite foolish about such things." "Aye," Hamish said noncommittally, accepting the soup. "That's possible." As she left, Hamish watched her walk down the path, her small figure bent against the rain. Something about her persistence in pushing the burglary theory bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. It was almost as if she was trying too hard to direct the investigation away from the villagers. Inside, he dried off and reviewed the photographs of Thorne's ledger on his phone. The blackmail operation had been extensive and cruel, but it was the newspaper clipping about Robert Ross's suicide that kept drawing his attention. A shopkeeper named Ross who had died 30 years ago, leaving a wife and daughter, and now in Lochdoub, a Mrs. Mary Ross who volunteered at the Heritage Centre and seemed to know everything about everyone. It might be nothing. Ross was a common name, but Hamish's instincts, honed by years of solving crimes in the Highlands, told him it was something important. He just had to figure out what. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. The rain had settled into the steady, relentless sort that the Highlands did so well, turning the landscape into varying shades of grey, and making even the hardiest souls think twice about venturing outdoors. Hamish sat in his kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee while Luggs dozed by the stove and Sonsi watched the rain with the disdain only a cat could muster. The photographs of Thorne's ledger lay spread across the table, a catalogue of human weakness and greed. Hamish had been studying them for the past hour, and each reading only deepened his contempt for the dead man. Thorne hadn't just been a blackmailer. He had been systematic about it, choosing victims who could afford to pay but couldn't afford exposure. His contemplation was interrupted by the roar of an engine that announced Blair's arrival before the Detective Chief Inspector had even parked his car. Hamish hastily gathered up the photographs and tucked them into a drawer as Blair burst through the door without knocking, his face red with triumph. "We've got him, Macbeth," Blair announced, water dripping from his coat onto Hamish's clean floor. "Archie McLean's Wellingtons matched the prints at the scene, and he's got no alibi for the time of death. I'm taking him in for formal charges this afternoon." "You might want to wait on that, sir," Hamish ventured. "I've learned some things that might—" "I don't care what you've learned," Blair interrupted. "This is an open and shut case. Local fisherman threatened with losing his livelihood takes revenge on the man who wronged him. The Procurator Fiscal will love it. But the locked room. Obviously McLean had help from someone inside. We'll get a confession soon enough." Blair stomped back out into the rain, leaving Hamish staring after him in frustration. The man was an idiot, but he was an idiot with the power to ruin an innocent person's life. Hamish pulled on his waterproof jacket and headed to the harbour, where he found Archie checking his lobster pots despite the weather. The fisherman looked up as Hamish approached, his weathered face grim. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" Archie said. "Blair thinks he has enough to charge you, but we both know you didn't do it, Archie, so I need you to tell me the truth about that night. All of it. Archie sighed and set down his pot. I was hiding in the pub cellar. Hiding from what? My wife. She'd been on at me all day about fixing the roof, organising the shed, painting the fence. You know how she gets. So when she came to the pub looking for me, I ducked down into the cellar and stayed there until closing time. Then I went home the long way round, past the old schoolhouse, which is why my boot prints are there. Can anyone confirm you were in the cellar? The barman knew I was there. He brought me down a dram now and then. Good lad, that one. Understands a man's need for peace and quiet. Hamish made a note to speak to the barman, though he suspected Blair wouldn't consider it a credible alibi. A wife-avoiding husband hiding in a pub cellar was exactly the sort of detail that would make Blair sneer. His next stop was Mrs. Mackenzie's bed and breakfast. Where Callum Vane had supposedly spent the night before the murder. Mrs. Mackenzie was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she looked nervous when Hamish appeared at her door. "Is this about the ledger?" she asked quietly. "About what that man knew? You've heard about that, then? The whole village has heard by now. Gossip travels fast in a place this small." She ushered him inside, glancing up and down the street as if afraid of being observed. That Thorn creature knew about my first marriage, or what I thought was a marriage. Turned out the man already had a wife in Glasgow. I was young and stupid, and when I found out the truth I left and came here to start fresh. But it would ruin me if it got out. People would say I'd been living in sin all those years. "Did you pay him?" "I was about to. He gave me a week to come up with £5,000, she wrung her hands. "But I didn't kill him, Hamish. I swear it." "What about Callum Vane? He was staying here, wasn't he?" "Aye, checked in the day before the murder. Kept odd hours, that one. Went out late and came back later. Paid cash and didn't want breakfast. Left the morning after the murder without a word." "Did he say anything about his uncle?" "Only that he was here to collect what was owed him. Had a look about him, if you know what I mean. Desperate and angry all at once." Hamish thanked her and headed back out into the rain. Callum Vane was looking more interesting by the minute. A man with gambling debts and a wealthy uncle who apparently refused to help him would have strong motivation for murder, particularly if he expected to inherit. He found Jimmy Anderson at the station in Strathbane, hunched over his desk and looking like he wished he was anywhere else. "Please tell me you've brought whiskey," Jimmy said as Hamish entered. "Better than that, I've brought information. What do you know about Callum Vane's movements the night of the murder?" Jimmy pulled out a file. Traffic cameras caught his car on the A9 at 11:45 that night, heading south toward Edinburgh. That's 50 miles from Lochdoub. Given the time of death was between midnight and 2, he couldn't have made it back in time to commit the murder. Unless he wasn't driving the car. We thought of that, but the camera footage shows him clearly behind the wheel. Blair's already ruled him out as a suspect. Which is why he's so fixated on your fisherman. Hamish studied the traffic camera photographs. The image was grainy but clear enough. Callum Vane was definitely driving, and the timestamp gave him an ironclad alibi. "What about Dr. Brodie?" Hamish asked, though he already knew the answer. "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight. The Reverend confirmed it, and so did 2 other players. They didn't break up until well after 12, and Brodie went straight home. His wife vouches for him being there by past. So we have Archie hiding in a cellar, Vane 50 miles away, and Brodie playing cards. And Blair about to charge Archie anyway," Jimmy added gloomily. "Unless you've got something better." Hamish thought about the ledger, about the newspaper clipping, about Mary Ross and her helpful suggestions. But he didn't have proof yet, just suspicions and a growing certainty that he was missing something crucial. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I'm working on it." That evening Hamish returned to the old schoolhouse. The building was dark, the police tape still fluttering in the wind, but he let himself in with the key that Mary had given him earlier in the investigation. He stood in the main schoolroom, trying to imagine the events of that night. The killer had struck Thorn from behind with the heavy book press. That much was clear. But how had they escaped from a room locked from the inside? He examined the windows again, checked the walls for hidden panels, even looked up at the ceiling for possible exits. Nothing. The room had been perfectly preserved as a Victorian schoolhouse, complete with old wooden desks, a blackboard, and various teaching implements on the walls. Hamish ran his hand along the wainscoting, feeling for any irregularities. The wood was solid, well maintained, clearly loved by whoever looked after the building. That would be Mary Ross, of course. She spent more time here than anyone else, cataloguing and organising, preserving the village's history. She would know every inch of this building. Hamish paused, his fingers on a section of wainscoting near the fireplace. Something about it felt different, though he couldn't say exactly what. He pressed against it experimentally, and to his surprise, it gave slightly. But before he could investigate further, he heard footsteps outside. He quickly moved away from the wall and turned to find Mary herself entering the building, wrapped in a raincoat and carrying a basket. "Hamish," she said, smiling. "I thought I saw a light. I brought you some dinner. I thought you might be working late on the case." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Ross." "Not at all. Any luck with your investigation?" "Bits and pieces. Nothing that makes sense yet." She set the basket down and looked around the room with a sad expression. "It's terrible to think of violence happening in this place. This building holds so much history for the village. It's been part of Loch for over 100 years. "You know it well, then?" "Better than anyone, I expect. I've spent years researching its history, cataloguing every item in the collection." She moved to the display case that had held the book press. That press was a particularly fine example of Victorian educational equipment. It's a terrible shame it was used for such a purpose." "Did you know the building before it became a heritage centre?" Something flickered in her eyes, too quick for Hamish to identify. "I grew up in Sutherland, Hamish. I didn't come to Loch until I took the teaching position 30 years ago." 30 years, Hamish repeated. "That's a long time." "It is. Long enough to call it home." She smiled at him again, that gentle, reassuring smile, and Hamish found himself smiling back despite the unease coiling in his stomach. "Well, I should let you get back to your work," Mary said. "Don't stay too late. You need your rest." After she left, Hamish stood alone in the quiet schoolroom, listening to the rain against the windows. 30 years ago, a man named Robert Ross had died in Sutherland, and 30 years ago, Mary Ross had come to Loch. It might be coincidence, but Hamish had learned, over his years as a policeman, that coincidences were rarely as innocent as they appeared. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Morning arrived with no improvement in the weather. If anything, the rain had intensified, driven by a wind that came straight off the Atlantic and seemed determined to work its way through every crack and crevice in Loch. Hamish woke to find Sonsie curled up on his bed, a liberty she usually reserved for the coldest nights, while Lugs had commandeered the spot directly in front of the stove. He had barely finished his breakfast when his mobile rang. It was the barman from the pub, a young lad named Colin, who sounded nervous. "Mr. Macbeth, you asked about Archie McLean being in the cellar that night." "Aye, I did." "Well, that policeman from Strathbane was here yesterday, the fat one who shouts a lot. He said if I gave Archie an alibi, he'd have me done for obstructing justice. Yeah, said I'd lose my job and probably go to jail." Hamish sighed. That was Blair all over, bullying witnesses to fit his preferred narrative. "Don't you worry about Blair, Colin. Just tell me the truth. Was Archie in the cellar?" "Aye, he was, from about 8 o'clock until we closed at 11. I brought him down 3 drams over the course of the evening. He was hiding from his missus as usual." "And you're willing to testify to that?" There was a pause. "If you promise that fat detective won't come after me." "I promise. And Colin, thank you for doing the right thing." Hamish rang off, feeling marginally better about Archie's situation. But an alibi until 11 o'clock didn't cover the time of death between midnight and 2. Archie could theoretically have left the pub, walked to the old schoolhouse, committed murder, and gone home. Blair would certainly argue that. He was pondering this problem when he noticed a figure lurking near the old schoolhouse, silhouetted against the grey morning light. Hamish grabbed his waterproof and headed out, Lugs trotting hopefully behind him, until he realised they were going out into the rain, at which point he retreated back to the warmth of the police station. As Hamish approached the schoolhouse, he recognised the figure as Dr. Brodie. The doctor was carrying something heavy in a burlap sack, moving furtively around the side of the building toward the woods beyond. "Dr. Brodie!" Hamish called out, and the doctor nearly jumped out of his skin. "Hamish, I didn't expect to see you out in this weather." "I could say the same about you." "What's in the sack?" The doctor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Guilt, resignation, and finally defeat. "You'd better come with me," he said quietly. They walked into the woods, the rain dripping through the bare branches above them. When they were well out of sight of the road, Dr. Brodie stopped and set down his burden. "I'm not a murderer, Hamish," he said, "but I am a fool." "What's in the sack, Doctor?" Brodie opened it, and the smell that emerged left no doubt. Fish. Salmon, to be precise, and not very fresh. "You're burying a salmon?" Hamish asked, bewildered. "The remains of one. Scales, guts, bones. I caught it 2 nights ago from the Laird stretch of the river. I know it was wrong, but we're a bit short of money just now, and Angela's been so pleased with how she's managing the budget. I didn't have the heart to tell her we couldn't afford proper meals." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Hamish felt a smile tugging at his lips. Here he was, investigating a murder, and he'd caught the prime suspect disposing of poached fish. "You were out here the night of the murder?" "Not here exactly. I buried it in a different spot initially, but then I realised how close it was to the schoolhouse. With all the forensics people tramping about, I was terrified they'd find it and think it was evidence of something sinister. So I dug it up last night and I'm reburying it farther away." "And the blood-stained sack Angela found?" "From gutting the fish. I told her it was old rags I'd used to clean up after a patient with a nosebleed." The doctor looked miserable. "I'm not cut out for a life of crime, Hamish. Not even minor poaching." Hamish made a decision. Poaching salmon was technically illegal, but it was also a tradition in these parts, and Dr. Brodie was a good man who had simply made a foolish choice. Blair, on the other hand, was a vindictive bully who would use this minor transgression to create maximum embarrassment. "Give me the sack," Hamish said. "What?" "I'll dispose of it properly, somewhere it won't be found and won't complicate the investigation. And doctor, next time you want salmon, buy it from the fishmonger like everyone else." The relief on Brodie's face was almost comical. "Thank you, Hamish. I don't know what I was thinking." "You were thinking you didn't want to worry your wife. It's understandable, if not particularly wise." After the doctor left, Hamish spent an unpleasant hour trudging through the rain to a bog several miles from the village, where he buried the evidence deep enough that it would never be found. It was messy, cold work, and by the time he returned to the police station, he was soaked through and smelling decidedly fishy. He was standing in the shower, trying to warm up and scrub away the smell, when he heard voices in the kitchen. Cursing under his breath, he dried off quickly and dressed, emerging to find Mary Ross calmly setting out tea things while Luggs watched with hopeful eyes. "I hope you don't mind," she said cheerfully. "The door was unlocked, and I thought you might appreciate some hot tea on such a miserable day. I saw you come back from your walk. You looked half drowned." "That's very thoughtful," Hamish said, wondering how she always seemed to appear at the most inconvenient moments. "Not at all. I know you've been working so hard on this dreadful case." She poured the tea with practised efficiency. "Any progress?" "Bits and pieces. Nothing conclusive yet." "I'm sure you'll solve it soon. You're very clever, Hamish, no matter what that awful Blair man says." She handed him a cup. "I've been thinking about the locked room problem. You know, there are several old buildings in the Highlands that have hidden passages, smugglers' routes from the days when they used to bring in French brandy to avoid the excise men. Perhaps the old schoolhouse has something similar." It was a reasonable suggestion, and yet something about the way she offered it bothered Hamish. It was almost as if she was trying to plant the idea in his head, directing his thinking along a particular path. "That's possible," he said non-committally. "Of course, if there was such a passage, I'm sure I would have found it by now. I've been over every inch of that building," she smiled. "But then again, some secrets are very well hidden, aren't they?" After she left, Hamish sat nursing his tea and thinking about hidden secrets. The wainscoting he'd pressed in the schoolroom had definitely moved, but he hadn't had time to investigate before Mary had interrupted him. Was it possible there really was a hidden passage? And if so, did Mary know about it? His phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy Anderson. Blair charging Archie tomorrow morning. Procurator Fiscal approved. Sorry, mate. Hamish stared at the message. He had less than 24 hours to prove Archie's innocence and identify the real killer. The pieces were there. He could feel it. The ledger, the newspaper clipping, Mary's helpful suggestions, the strange behaviour around the schoolhouse. He pulled out his phone and looked again at the photograph of the old newspaper article about Robert Ross's suicide. Then he opened his laptop and began searching for more information about the Ross family of Sutherland. If his suspicions were correct, the secret that had killed Percival Thorne had its roots 30 years in the past, and the gentle, helpful Mrs. Mary Ross was somehow at the centre of it all. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in Lochdoub a killer was going about their daily business, confident that they had committed the perfect crime. But Hamish Macbeth, or lazy as he was reputed to be, had never yet failed to solve a case when he put his mind to it. And he was putting his mind to this one now. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Hamish spent the evening hunched over his laptop searching through old newspaper archives and public records. The internet, he had to admit, was occasionally useful for police work, even if it lacked the personal touch of a good gossip session at the pub. What he found was illuminating, if not entirely surprising. Robert Ross had indeed owned a small general store in a village near Dornoch 30 years ago. According to the newspaper reports, he had entered into a business partnership with a London financier who promised to expand the shop into a chain across the Highlands. The financier was never named in the articles, but he had apparently convinced Ross to mortgage his property and invest his life savings in the venture. When the business collapsed, Ross was left with nothing. The property was seized by the bank, and Ross, facing ruin and disgrace, had taken his own life. He left behind a wife, Elizabeth, and a daughter, Mary, aged 15. Hamish sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Mary Ross would be 45 now, which matched the age of the woman who had lived in Lochdoub for 30 years. The timing fit perfectly. But could a gentle schoolmistress really be a murderer? And if so, how had she managed the locked room? He was still pondering this when his phone rang. It was Reverend Wellington, sounding apologetic. "Hamish, I hope I'm not disturbing you at this late hour, but I've been troubled in my conscience about something." "What is it, Reverend?" "That night of the murder, you asked about Dr. Brodie's alibi. I confirmed that he was playing cards with us until midnight, and that's true. But I feel I should clarify that it was closer to 12:15 when he actually left. I didn't think it mattered, but with Blair talking about charging Archie, I wanted to make sure you had all the facts." "Thank you, Reverend. That's helpful." After hanging up, Hamish made a note. 12:15 still gave Brodie time to get to the old schoolhouse, before the murder window closed at 2 a.m, but it made it considerably tighter. And the doctor had been on foot that evening, as Mrs. Brodie had the car. The next morning brought no relief from the rain, but it did bring clearer thinking. Hamish made a list of his remaining suspects and their alibis, determined to eliminate each one methodically before Blair could make his arrest. First, Archie McLean. Hamish drove to the pub and had another word with Colin the barman, this time getting him to write out a formal statement. Archie had been in the cellar until closing at 11, confirmed. But what about after? Hamish tracked down Archie at the harbour and questioned him again. The fisherman, now thoroughly frightened by the prospect of arrest, was more forthcoming. "After I left the pub, I went straight home, took the long way round to avoid my wife's usual route from Bingo, walked past the schoolhouse about 11:30, which is when I left those boot prints. But I swear to you, Hamish, I went directly home after that." "Can your wife confirm what time you arrived?" Archie's face reddened. "She was already asleep, or pretending to be, more like. When I came in, she didn't say a word, which meant she was either dead to the world or so angry she couldn't speak. I'm hoping it was the former." Hamish sighed. An unconfirmed arrival time wasn't ideal, but the timeline was getting tight. If Archie had been home by midnight, he couldn't have committed a murder that occurred after that time. Next was Callum Vane. Hamish rang Jimmy Anderson and asked him to double-check the traffic camera evidence. "Already done," Jimmy said. "Blair had me verify it 3 times. Vane's car was definitely on the A9 at 11:45 heading south. The next camera caught him 20 miles further on at 12:30. There's no way he could have doubled back to Lockdube, committed murder, and made it to the second camera in time. The man's clean, at least for this crime. What about the gambling debts? Oh, he's definitely in trouble there. Edinburgh police are looking for him on behalf of some very unpleasant bookmakers, but he's not our killer." That left Dr. Brodie. Hamish found the doctor at his surgery, looking considerably more relaxed now that he wasn't worried about buried fish being discovered. "Doctor, I need to verify your movements after you left the card game." "I went straight home, Hamish, walked through the village, arrived about 12:30. Angela was already in bed reading. She can confirm the time." "And you didn't go anywhere near the old schoolhouse?" "Not that night, no. Why would I? The man was threatening me, yes, but I'm not a violent person. Besides, I had no idea how to get into a locked building, even if I'd wanted to." Hamish believed him. Dr. Brodie simply didn't have the temperament for murder, and his alibi was solid enough. He returned to the police station to find Mary Ross once again on his doorstep, this time with what she called a new discovery. "I was going through some old records at the Heritage Centre," she said, her eyes bright with apparent excitement, "and I found this note tucked into one of the deed books." She handed him a folded piece of paper. It was written in a rough hand on cheap notepaper, and it read, "Thorn, you'll get what's coming to you. You've ruined your last family. Archie MacLean." Hamish examined the note carefully. The handwriting did look similar to Archie's scrawl, though it could easily be forged by someone with access to examples of his writing. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. "Tucked into the back of the 1950s deed registry. I was cataloguing and it just fell out. I brought it straight to you." "How convenient," Hamish said mildly. Something flickered in Mary's eyes. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mrs. Ross. I'll make sure it gets to the proper authorities." After she left, Hamish studied the note under his desk lamp. The paper was new, not old, despite being tucked into a book from the 1950s, and the timing was simply too perfect. Just as Blair was about to arrest Archie, evidence appeared that would seal his fate. Someone was trying very hard to frame the fisherman, and that someone had unlimited access to the Heritage Centre and its contents. Hamish made a decision. He needed to search the old schoolhouse thoroughly, without interruption, and without Mary Ross appearing to offer helpful suggestions, which meant he needed to do it when she would be otherwise occupied. He rang the Curry twins. "Nessie, Jessie, I need a favour. Could you invite Mrs. Ross to tea this afternoon? Keep her occupied for an hour or so." "We could do that," Nessie said. "Do that," Jessie confirmed. "What's this about, Hamish?" "Just following a lead, nothing to worry about." At 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Mary Ross was safely ensconced in the Curry twins' cottage being plied with tea and scones, Hamish let himself into the old schoolhouse. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the village shrouded in a thick mist that muffled all sound. He went straight to the wainscoting he'd noticed before near the old fireplace. Pressing carefully, he felt it give. This time, he persisted, running his fingers along the edge until he found a small, concealed catch. The panel swung open with a creak, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. Hamish pulled out his torch and shone it into the darkness. The passage was old, very old, built into the fabric of the building itself. It ran alongside the main schoolroom before turning sharply and descending via a crude set of stairs. He followed it carefully, ducking his head in the low spaces. The passage emerged in what had once been a coal cellar, now used for storage. From there, a door led outside to the back of the building, so that was how it had been done. The killer had struck Thorn, bolted the door from inside, then escaped through the hidden passage, emerging outside where they could easily slip away unnoticed in the dark. But who besides Mary would have known about this passage? She claimed to have examined every inch of the building, to know its history better than anyone. If there was a secret passage, she would have found it years ago. Unless, of course, she had known about it all along. Hamish photographed the passage thoroughly, then carefully closed the panel and made his way back to the police station. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture he didn't much like but couldn't ignore. Mary Ross had motive, opportunity, and knowledge. She had been helpful to the point of suspicion, always appearing at the right moments with the right suggestions, steering the investigation away from herself and toward other suspects. Now all Hamish needed was proof, and perhaps, if he was clever about it, a confession. But confronting a killer required careful planning. Yeah, particularly when that killer had already demonstrated their ability to commit murder and escape detection. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he would set his trap. Tonight he would make sure he had all the pieces in place. Chapter 8. The Schoolmistress's Flaw. Hamish woke before dawn, his mind already racing through the details of the case. Luggs, sensing that this was not a morning for leisurely breakfasts and long walks, stayed curled on his bed while Sonsi watched from the window-sill with her usual inscrutability. The timeline Mary had provided to Blair sat on Hamish's desk, and he studied it again with fresh eyes. She had been meticulous, listing every villager Thorne had threatened, every argument, every potential motive. Too meticulous, perhaps, for someone who had supposedly just stumbled upon a murder scene in shock. And then there was the detail that had been nagging at him. Mary had mentioned that Thorne was researching a specific historical book about Lockdow property deeds. Yeah, she had even named it, The Highland Registry of 1823 by Malcolm Fraser. Hamish pulled out his laptop and searched for the title. Nothing appeared. He tried variations, different spellings, different years. Still nothing. He rang the Historical Society in Inverness, catching the archivist just as she arrived for work. "I'm looking for information about a book called The Highland Registry of 1823, Hamish said, by Malcolm Fraser. One moment. He heard the clicking of computer keys. "I'm not finding anything by that title. Who was the publisher?" "I don't know. It was supposed to contain property deeds from the Lockdow area." More clicking. "I'm sorry, Constable, but there's no record of such a book. Are you certain of the title?" "No," Hamish said slowly. "I'm not certain at all." After hanging up, he searched through his notes again. Mary had claimed Thorne was examining this book on the night he died, using it to verify deeds. But if the book didn't exist, how would Thorne have been examining it? And more importantly, how would Mary have known what he was researching unless she had been there? It was a tiny slip, the kind that might go unnoticed in the confusion of a murder investigation. But it was a slip nonetheless. Hamish's next discovery came when he returned to the old schoolhouse. In the grey morning light, he examined the main schoolroom more carefully, getting down on his hands and knees to look at the floor near where Thorne's body had been found. There, caught between two floorboards, was a small fragment of coloured chalk, not white, but a pale blue of the sort used for decorative work on blackboards. He bagged it carefully and continued his search. Near the display case that had held the book press, he found something else, a tiny scrap of wallpaper, Victorian in style, with a distinctive pattern of roses and ivy. He recognised it immediately. Mary had used that exact paper in her restoration of several heritage displays, recreating the look of period classrooms. The paper was fresh, not old. Someone had brushed against the display recently, perhaps while struggling with the heavy book press, and a corner had torn loose. Hamish photographed everything, then sat back on his heels thinking. The chalk could have come from Mary's work on the heritage displays. The wallpaper definitely had. Neither was conclusive on its own, but together with the non-existent book and the planted threatening note, they formed a damning pattern. He needed to know more about Mary's past, about Robert Ross and what had really happened 30 years ago, and for that he needed to go directly to the source. The records office in Dornoch was a squat grey building that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with spectacles on a chain, listened to Hamish's request and disappeared into the archives. She returned 20 minutes later with a file box. "Robert Ross," she said. "Died 1996. It was quite a scandal at the time. The poor man lost everything." Hamish opened the file and began reading. The story was much as he had already learned. A business venture gone wrong, a partnership with a London financier, bankruptcy and suicide. But there were additional details in the police report that hadn't made it into the newspapers. Or Robert Ross had not simply hanged himself in despair. He had left a note claiming that the London financier had deliberately defrauded him, that the entire business venture had been a scheme to acquire his property at below market value. The note also made a more disturbing claim, that Ross had confronted the financier and in a rage had struck him, causing serious injury. Ross wrote that he couldn't live with what he had done, couldn't face trial for assault, and saw death as his only option. "Was anyone ever charged?" Hamish asked. The clerk shook her head. The financier apparently recovered from his injuries but declined to press charges. Probably didn't want the publicity. The whole thing was swept under the rug. And the family, Ross's wife and daughter, they left the area shortly after. I believe there were relatives in Sutherland, but I couldn't say where they ended up. Hamish photographed the relevant documents and drove back to Lochdoub, his mind working furiously. Robert Ross had assaulted the man who ruined him. That was the first murder mentioned in the outline. Not a murder exactly, but an act of violence born of desperation and rage. And now, 30 years later, that financier's son had come to Lochdoub, threatening to expose old secrets and seize the building that had once been Ross family property. The old schoolhouse. Hamish pulled over to the side of the road and checked the property records he had photographed from Thorne's cottage. There it was. The old schoolhouse had been built on land originally owned by the Ross family, sold off during the bankruptcy proceedings. Mary Ross hadn't just been working at the Heritage Centre. She had been working in what should have been her family home, the property her father had lost before taking his own life. Hamish sat in his Land Rover, watching the rain start up again, and felt a deep sadness settle over him. Mary Ross had spent 30 years in Lochdoub, teaching children, volunteering, being kind to everyone. And all the while she had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to take revenge on the family that had destroyed hers. His phone rang. It was Jimmy Anderson, sounding harried. "Hamish, Blair's on his way to arrest Archie in an hour. He's got that note Mary found, and he's convinced it's enough along with the boot prints. I've tried to reason with him, but you know what he's like." "I know. Jimmy, I need you to stall him." "How am I supposed to do that?" "I don't know. Spill coffee on his shirt, lose his car keys, tell him there's been a triple homicide in Strathbane. Anything. I need 2 hours." "Hamish, 2 hours, Jimmy. I've got your killer, but I need time to prove it." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." After hanging up, Hamish drove back to the police station and gathered his evidence. The photographs of the hidden passage, the chalk, the wallpaper fragment, the fake threatening note, and most importantly the documents proving Mary's identity and connection to the property. Then he made one more call, this one to Mary Ross herself. "Mrs. Ross, could you meet me at the old schoolhouse this afternoon? There's something I'd like to discuss with you about the case." Her voice was warm and helpful as always. "Of course, Hamish. What time?" 2 o'clock? I'll be there." Hamish hung up and looked at Luggs, who had finally deigned to get out of bed and was now watching his master with his odd, slightly anxious expression. "Well, boy," Hamish said quietly, "let's hope I'm right about this, because if I'm wrong, Archie McLean's going to jail and the killer's going to go free." Luggs whined softly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Lochdoub, washing the streets clean but unable to wash away 30 years of buried secrets and carefully nurtured revenge. At 2 o'clock, Hamish would face Mary Ross in the scene of her crime, and one way or another, the truth would finally come out. He spent the intervening hours preparing, arranging his evidence, and making sure that Jimmy Anderson knew where he was and what he was doing. If Mary Ross had killed once, she might be desperate enough to kill again. But Hamish had faced killers before, and he had never yet failed to bring them to justice. He just hoped that this time, justice would be tempered with understanding. Because whatever Mary Ross had done, she had done it for reasons that, however terrible, were rooted in genuine pain and loss. Sometimes, Hamish reflected, being a policeman in the Highlands meant balancing the letter of the law with the realities of human nature, and this case, more than most, would test that balance to its limits. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. The old schoolhouse seemed different in the grey afternoon light, its familiar walls now heavy with secrets. Hamish arrived early and waited in the main schoolroom, standing near the window where he could watch Mary approach. He had positioned his evidence carefully on one of the old desks, each piece telling part of the story. Mary arrived precisely at 2:00, punctual as always. She wore a neat grey cardigan and carried her usual basket, though today it was empty of scones or thermoses. Something in her bearing had changed, Hamish noticed. The helpful softness had receded, replaced by a watchful stillness. "Hamish," she said, stepping into the room, "you sounded quite serious on the telephone." "I am serious, Mrs. Ross. Or should I say, Miss Ross? You never married." "Did you?" She set down her basket slowly. "No, I never did. Your father was Robert Ross of Dornoch. This building, the old schoolhouse, was built on land that belonged to your family." Mary's face showed no surprise, only a calm acceptance. "You've been doing your homework." "It's my job. Your father lost everything 30 years ago to a London financier. Lost his business, his property, his hope. And in the end, he lost his life." "My father was murdered," Mary said quietly, moving further into the room. "Perhaps not with a weapon, but murdered nonetheless. That man destroyed him deliberately, systematically for profit. That man was Percival Thorne's father. Yes, Malcolm Thorne, a vulture in expensive suits who made his fortune ruining people like my father. He would identify struggling businesses, offer partnership, gain their trust, then strip them of everything they owned through legal trickery." Her voice remained steady, but her hands clenched. "My father was a good man, Hamish. Honest, hard-working, kind. And Malcolm Thorne turned him into a desperate criminal. Your father assaulted Malcolm Thorne. My father struck the man who had destroyed our lives. One blow, in a moment of rage and despair. Malcolm Thorne recovered fully. My father never did." Hamish gestured to the documents on the desk. "According to the police report, your father's suicide note mentioned the assault. He was afraid of prosecution, of bringing more shame on the family. He was protecting me and my mother. We were already being evicted, living on charity. If he'd gone to prison, we would have had nothing." Mary walked to the window. Looking out at the village she had called home for 3 decades. "My mother never recovered from the loss. She died 5 years after we moved here. Broken heart, the doctor said, though the death certificate read pneumonia." "Why did you come to Lochdoub?" "Because this was our land once, this building, this place. My great-grandfather built the original structure. It should have been mine." She turned back to face him. "I took the teaching position when it came available, and I waited. I thought perhaps I could buy it back someday, restore what had been taken from us. But then I learned the truth." "What truth?" "That Malcolm Thorne hadn't just stolen our property through bankruptcy proceedings. He'd forged documents to ensure the sale went through at a fraction of its value. My father had discovered this just before his death. That's why he confronted Thorne. That's why he struck him. He had proof of the fraud, Hamish, but he was too broken to fight any more." Hamish picked up one of the photocopied documents from Thorne's ledger, and then Percival Thorne came to Lochdoub. At first I didn't know who he was, just another arrogant solicitor making threats, but when he came to the Heritage Centre to examine the deed records, I recognised the name on his business card. Thorne and Associates, the same firm his father had run. He found out who you were. Mary laughed, a bitter sound. Oh, he was clever about it. Started asking questions about the building's history, about previous owners. When I gave him the official version, he smiled. That awful, superior smile. Then he told me he knew exactly who I was, said his father had kept excellent records, including details about every property he'd acquired. He threatened you. Worse. He told me about my father's assault, said he had documentation proving it was attempted murder, not just a simple assault. Claimed he could have my father's name dragged through the mud posthumously, have him remembered as a violent criminal rather than a victim, and he would do it unless I paid him to keep quiet. But there was more, wasn't there? Mary met his eyes directly for the first time. He told me he was going to take this building, had some legal technicality about the original deed transfer, said it would fetch a good price from developers, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. He was going to destroy my father's memory and take the last piece of our family heritage, just like his father had done 30 years ago. So you killed him? Yes. The word was simple, definitive. I arranged to meet him here that night, told him I would pay what he asked. I knew this building better than anyone, knew about the hidden passage from my research. My great-grandfather had it built during the clearances, a way to hide from the landlord's men. I spent months confirming it was still passable. She walked to the display case where the book press had stood. He came at midnight, smug and greedy. I struck him from behind with the press. One blow, like my father had struck his father. Poetic, don't you think? Then I bolted the door, left through the passage, and went home. I was back in my cottage before anyone knew what had happened. And the Helpful Widow Act. I've been a teacher for 30 years, Hamish. I know how to manage people, how to guide them toward the conclusions I want them to reach. Blair was easy. All I had to do was point him at other suspects and provide him with lists and helpful suggestions. He's not a particularly intelligent man. No, Hamish agreed, he's not. But I am. Mary smiled sadly. Yes, I knew you would figure it out eventually. You're too observant, too persistent. The non-existent book was sloppy of me. I was improvising, trying to explain how I knew what Thorne was researching. Why the threatening note from Archie? Insurance. When I realised you were getting close, I needed to redirect your attention. Poor Archie. He's not a bad man, just loud and foolish. I thought Blair would arrest him and close the case before you could piece together the truth. Hamish felt a wave of sadness wash over him. I understand why you did it, Mary, I do, but it's still murder. I know, and I'm not sorry. She stood straighter, and in that moment Hamish could see the girl she had been, watching her father's business collapse, seeing her mother's heart break, carrying 30 years of grief and rage. Percival Thorne was a monster, just like his father. The world is better without him. That's not for you to decide, isn't it? The law didn't protect my father. The law didn't punish Malcolm Thorne for his fraud. The law failed us completely, so I made my own justice. And now, Mary picked up her basket calmly, now you arrest me, I suppose. Take me to Strathbane. Let Blair claim the credit for solving his case. That's what happens next, isn't it? Aye, Hamish said heavily. That's what happens next. She nodded, accepting. May I ask you something first? Will you tell them? About my father? About what really happened? Hamish thought about Robert Ross, driven to assault and suicide by a ruthless con man. About Mary, spending 30 years waiting for closure that never came. About the complicated nature of justice in a world where the law didn't always serve the innocent. I'll tell them what they need to know, he said carefully. No more, no less. Thank you, Hamish. That's kind. There's nothing kind about this, Mrs. Ross. No, she agreed. I suppose there isn't. But you're a good man nonetheless. Lochdoub is lucky to have you. As Hamish led her out of the old schoolhouse, the building that had been at the centre of 2 generations of tragedy, he felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders. He had solved the murder, caught the killer, and saved an innocent man from wrongful arrest. But he took no satisfaction in it. Sometimes he reflected solving a crime meant understanding that justice and the law were not always the same thing. And sometimes being a good policeman meant carrying the burden of that knowledge alone. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a weak sun was trying to break through the clouds. But the light it cast seemed cold and cheerless, offering no warmth, no comfort, only clarity. And in police work, as in life, clarity often came at a price. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The aftermath of Mary Ross's arrest played out exactly as Hamish had predicted, which gave him no pleasure whatsoever. Blair arrived at the police station like a conquering hero, his chest puffed out with self-importance, ready to take credit for cracking what he called the most complex case in Strathbane CID history. The fact that Hamish had done all the actual detective work was, as usual, conveniently overlooked. "Brilliant police work," Blair announced to the small crowd that had gathered outside the station. "Methodical, professional investigation led us straight to the killer. The evidence was overwhelming once we knew where to look." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a slight shrug that conveyed both apology and resignation. This was how it always went with Blair. He claimed the glory while others did the work. Hamish had carefully arranged the evidence in Mary's teacher's satchel, which he had discovered during a routine search of the Heritage Centre. The satchel contained Thorne's blackmail ledger, the fragments of chalk and wallpaper that matched the crime scene, and detailed notes about the hidden passage in Mary's own handwriting. "Found it tucked behind a bookshelf," Hamish had reported to Blair with his usual expression of vacant amiability. "Just lucky, I suppose." Blair had seized upon the evidence with glee, never questioning how convenient the discovery had been, or why Mary Ross would have kept such incriminating material. Critical thinking had never been Blair's strong suit. The formal arrest took place that evening. Mary went quietly, maintaining her dignity even as Blair blustered about the long arm of the law and justice being served. She caught Hamish's eye once as they led her to the police car, and something passed between them, not quite understanding, but perhaps acknowledgement. The villagers' reaction was one of shocked disbelief. Mrs. Ross, the sweet schoolmistress who had taught their children and baked scones for every church function. A murderer? It seemed impossible. But as the story emerged, carefully edited by Hamish to focus on the murder itself rather than the tragic history behind it, the shock gave way to a more complicated mixture of sympathy and condemnation. Percival Thorne had been a blackmailer and a bully after all. Few people in Lochdoub mourned his passing, even if they couldn't quite condone murder. The Curry twins, predictably, had opinions. "Always something off about her," Nessie declared, conveniently forgetting 30 years of friendship. "Off about her," Jessie agreed. "Too helpful, she was." Too helpful. Hamish let them talk. The village needed to process what had happened in its own way, and if that meant rewriting history to make the revelation less shocking, so be it. Archie McLean, released from custody with profuse apologies that Blair somehow managed to make sound grudging, bought Hamish a drink at the pub. "I owe you, Hamish," the fisherman said, his voice thick with emotion. "Blair would have had me in prison for something I didn't do." "Just doing my job," Hamish replied mildly, though they both knew it was more than that. "Still, if you ever need anything, you just ask." "I'll keep that in mind, Archie." 3 days after the arrest, Hamish received a summons to Strathbane headquarters. His heart sank. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Blair's successful resolution of a high-profile murder case would be used to justify some organisational restructuring, and Hamish would find himself promoted whether he wanted it or not. The superintendent's office was as depressing as Hamish remembered. Grey walls, grey carpet, grey filing cabinets. Even the superintendent himself seemed grey. A colourless man who dealt in statistics and efficiency ratings. "Constable Macbeth," the superintendent began, shuffling papers on his desk. "Detective Chief Inspector Blair has submitted a report on the Lochdoub murder investigation." Here it comes, Hamish thought. According to his report, you were assigned to support the investigation by maintaining order in the village and providing local knowledge. "Aye, sir." Blair notes that you performed these duties adequately, though he expresses some concern about your overall initiative and drive, says you're content to do the minimum required and show little ambition for advancement. Hamish kept his expression neutral, though internally he was blessing Blair's enormous ego. The Detective Chief Inspector was so determined to claim all the credit that he had effectively written Hamish out of the investigation entirely. He also notes, the superintendent continued, that you failed to identify the hidden passage in the old schoolhouse during your initial examination of the crime scene, and that the critical evidence was discovered by Blair's team during a more thorough search. That's correct, sir, Hamish lied smoothly. I missed it completely. The superintendent made a note. Well, Constable, I'm afraid this confirms what we've long suspected. You lack the analytical skills and ambition necessary for promotion to sergeant. You'll remain at your current posting in Loch Dubh indefinitely. Hamish fought to keep the relief from showing on his face. I understand, sir. That will be all. As Hamish left the office, he found Jimmy Anderson waiting in the corridor, trying unsuccessfully to suppress a grin. You crafty bastard, Jimmy said quietly. You played Blair like a fiddle. I don't know what you mean, Hamish replied with perfect innocence. The hell you don't. You solved the case. Handed Blair the evidence on a silver platter and made sure he got all the credit. Which means he can't very well argue that you deserve a promotion, can he? These things work out the way they're meant to, Jimmy. Aye, they do. Especially when you're pulling the strings, Jimmy clapped him on the shoulder. Enjoy your exile in Loch Dubh, Hamish. Some of us will be stuck here in this grey hellhole with Blair. You could always request a transfer to a village posting, and give up the Strathbay nightlife. Not likely. They shared a drink before Hamish drove back to Loch Dubh, the winter sun already setting over the hills. The village looked particularly beautiful in the fading light, the loch reflecting the pink and orange sky, smoke rising from cottage chimneys in the still air. He parked the Land Rover outside the police station and found Lugs waiting by the door, tail wagging in greeting. Sonsie appeared from wherever she spent her days, hunting probably, and wound herself around his legs with a purr like distant thunder. Come on then, Hamish said to them both. Let's have our dinner. Inside, the police station was warm and comfortable, everything exactly as he liked it. He fed the animals, made himself a cup of tea, and settled into his favourite chair with a piece of shortbread from the tin Mrs. Wellington had brought round that morning. The case of Percival Thorne's murder was closed. Mary Ross would face trial, though Hamish suspected that a good defence lawyer would make much of the extenuating circumstances. She might even get a reduced sentence, given her age and previously unblemished record. The village would recover as villages always did. The old schoolhouse would eventually reopen, perhaps with someone new to manage the heritage collection. Life would go on, and Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he wanted to be, in his beloved Loch Dubh, avoiding promotion, solving crimes when necessary, and spending the rest of his time tending his sheep, feeding his animals, and enjoying the peace of Highland life. Outside, night settled over the village like a blanket. The black waters of Loch Dubh were calm, reflecting the first stars. Somewhere in the hills, a fox barked. The wind carried the salt smell of the sea. Hamish looked around his small kingdom, the police station that was also his home, the village that was his responsibility and his refuge, and felt a deep contentment settle over him. He had done his job. Justice, of a sort, had been served. An innocent man had been saved from wrongful imprisonment, and best of all, he had managed to avoid promotion once again. In Hamish Macbeth's view, that made it a very successful case indeed. "What do you think, Lugs?" he asked the dog, who was eyeing the remaining shortbread with hopeful attention. "Shall we call it a night?" Lugs wagged his tail in agreement. Hamish broke off a piece of shortbread and shared it with his faithful companion. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new challenges, perhaps even new crimes. But tonight, all was well in Loch Dubh, and for a lazy Highland constable who wanted nothing more than to be left in peace, that was everything. The end.